Hi there. Welcome to Eerie Tales for Restful Sleep. Settle in for a chilling bedtime story mixed with soothing rain. Perfect for those who love a little horror before sleep. No jump scares, just calm, haunting tales to help you unwind. If you enjoy these eerie nights, please subscribe, like, comment, and share to join our community of brave night owls. Sleep tight, if you dare. The tempting offer, it always starts with a decision you barely remember making. For Vincent Carrera, that decision came at 11:47 p.m. on a Tuesday, at a time when most people are already deep in sleep, and the world outside is left to the desperate, the restless, and the ones with nowhere else to go. Vincent was one of them, though he'd never admit it out loud. He'd been driving for hours, the city's neon glow fading behind him, his body aching from the monotony of the night shift. The coffee in his cup holder had long since gone cold, and his bladder was sending increasingly urgent signals that it was time to call it quits. But as he pulled over to check his phone, a new request flashed across the screen. It was the kind of ride every driver dreams about, at least on the surface. The pickup was just 6 blocks away, and the destination was a straight shot across the state, Orlando to Naples. Not a quick trip, not by any means. But the fare, nearly $300, enough to cover his overdue rent, with a little left over for groceries, and maybe even a bottle of something strong to help him forget the week. For a moment, Vincent's finger hovered over the decline button. He could almost feel the relief of going home, collapsing into bed, and letting the world fade away. But the numbers on the screen were relentless, and the math was simple. He needed the money. He always needed the money. He accepted the ride. The app chirped its approval, and Vincent felt a familiar mix of resignation and hope. Maybe this would be the break he needed. Maybe the universe was finally throwing him a bone. He started the engine, the dashboard lights flickering in the darkness, and pulled out onto the empty street. The city at this hour was a different animal, quieter, but somehow more alive with possibility and threat. The street lights cast long shadows across the pavement, and the only other cars belonged to people with stories as complicated as his own. The pickup address led him to a strip mall, the kind of place that looked abandoned even during the day. At night, it was a wasteland of empty parking spaces and flickering neon signs. The only sign of life was the harsh fluorescent glow spilling out from a 24-hour laundromat, its windows fogged with condensation and the ghosts of 100 late-night conversations. Vincent pulled up to the curb, scanning the lot for his passenger. He expected the usual college kid, maybe, or someone who'd missed the last bus home. Instead, he saw a single figure standing beneath the broken sign of a closed Chinese restaurant. The man didn't move when Vincent's headlights swept over him. He stood perfectly still, hands clasped behind his back, as if he'd been waiting there for hours or for years. He was tall, at least 6 feet, with a lean build that suggested either careful discipline or the kind of genetics you can't buy. His hair was silver white, swept back from a high forehead, and even in the uncertain light, Vincent could tell his clothes were expensive. Not flashy, but the kind of understated luxury that only people with real money ever wear. A charcoal wool coat, perfectly tailored, over a suit that probably cost more than Vincent made in a month. Vincent rolled down the passenger window, forcing a smile that felt brittle around the edges. "You the ride to Naples?" he called out, trying to keep his voice casual. The man turned, his movements precise and economical, and approached the car with the confidence of someone who had never been kept waiting in his life. When he spoke, his voice was low and cultured, carrying the faintest trace of an accent Vincent couldn't quite place. "Vincent Carrera. Thank you for accepting the request at such a late hour." There was something in the way the man said his name, not a question, but a statement, as if he were confirming a fact he already knew. Vincent's hands tightened on the steering wheel, a reflex he couldn't control. He forced himself to nod, glancing at the rearview mirror to get a better look at his passenger's face. The man was older, maybe 60, with pale blue eyes that seemed to catalog every detail they encountered. His skin was almost translucent, stretched tight over high cheekbones, and there was a familiarity to his features that Vincent couldn't quite place. Had they met before? Was this someone from the old days, back when life was simpler, or, at least, when the lies were easier to tell? The man opened the rear door and slid into the back seat with a fluid grace that didn't match his age. He settled in, folding his hands in his lap, and looked straight ahead, as if he'd done this 1,000 times before. Vincent adjusted his mirror, trying to shake off the sense of unease that had settled over him like a second skin. "No problem," Vincent said, his voice a little too loud in the quiet car. "Long trip ahead of us, though. You sure you don't want to fly?" "I'm quite certain," the man replied, his tone polite but final. "I prefer to travel by car when possible. One sees so much more of the country that way." Vincent nodded, pulling away from the curb and merging onto the main road. The city lights faded behind them, replaced by the endless ribbon of highway stretching out into the darkness. For a while, they drove in silence. The only sounds, the hum of the engine and the occasional rattle of something loose in the trunk. Vincent tried to focus on the road, but his mind kept drifting back to the man in the back seat. There was something about him, something that didn't fit. He was too calm, too composed, as if he were in control of more than just his own fate. As they passed the last of the city's strip malls and fast food joints, Vincent found himself glancing at the rearview mirror more often than usual. The man's eyes never left the road ahead, but Vincent could feel the weight of his gaze, as if he were being measured and found wanting. He tried to shake it off, telling himself it was just nerves, just the exhaustion of too many nights, spent chasing fares and running from memories, but the feeling wouldn't go away. He thought about the money again, about the rent that was due and the landlord's thinly veiled threats. He thought about the groceries he'd have to buy, the bills piling up on the kitchen table, the endless grind of survival. This ride was supposed to be a blessing, a chance to get ahead, if only for a moment. But as the miles slipped by and the darkness pressed in around them, Vincent couldn't shake the sense that he'd made a mistake. That somewhere in the space between need and desperation, he'd opened a door that should have stayed closed. The highway stretched out before them, empty and endless, and Vincent drove on, unaware that the real journey was only just beginning. The mysterious passenger. The first thing Vincent noticed as the car slid onto the highway was the silence. Not the comfortable, companionable quiet that sometimes settles between strangers on a long drive, but a silence that felt deliberate, almost ritualistic. The man in the back seat didn't fidget, didn't check his phone, didn't even look out the window. He simply sat, hands folded, eyes fixed on the horizon, as if he were waiting for something only he could see. Vincent tried to fill the void with the usual small talk. "So, Naples, huh? That's a long way to go this late. Business or pleasure?" His voice sounded thin in the darkness, bouncing off the windshield and dying in the empty space between them. The man's response was measured, almost rehearsed. "A bit of both, I suppose. I have some old acquaintances to meet. Unfinished business, you might say." There was a faint smile in his voice, but it didn't reach his eyes. If anything, it made Vincent more uneasy. He glanced at the rearview mirror, trying to get a better look at his passenger. The man's face was illuminated by the soft glow of passing streetlights, each flash revealing a new detail. The sharp line of his jaw, the almost imperceptible scar above his left eyebrow, the way his eyes seemed to reflect the world without ever truly revealing what was inside. There was something ageless about him, as if he'd stepped out of a different era and simply slipped into the present without anyone noticing. Vincent's mind raced through possibilities. Maybe the guy was some kind of executive, the kind who closed million-dollar deals over steak dinners and never had to worry about rent. Or maybe he was a retired professor, the kind who collected rare books and spoke 5 languages. But there was something about the way he carried himself, something that suggested a different kind of power. The kind that didn't come from money or education, but from secrets. The kind of power that made other people nervous without ever raising its voice. The car sped through the outskirts of Orlando, past the last gas stations and fast food chains, into the dark stretch of highway that cut through the heart of Florida. The world outside the windows became a blur of shadows and occasional flashes of light, distant headlights. The glow of a billboard advertising a lawyer who promised to fight for you. The red eyes of a raccoon caught in the beams before it darted back into the underbrush. Vincent tried again. "You from around here?" he asked, forcing a note of casual curiosity into his voice. The man's lips curled into a faint smile. "I've spent time in many places. Florida has a certain character, don't you think? The kind of place where the past never really stays buried." Vincent felt a chill crawl up his spine. He told himself it was just the air conditioning, but he knew better. There was something about the way the man spoke, each word carefully chosen, each sentence carrying more weight than it should. It was as if you were speaking in code, and Vincent was missing the key. He focused on the road, trying to ignore the growing sense of unease. The highway was nearly empty, just the occasional trucker or insomniac making their way through the night. The darkness pressed in on all sides, broken only by the twin beams of Vincent's headlights and the faint glow of the dashboard. After a few minutes, the man spoke again, his voice low and almost hypnotic. "You must see a lot of interesting people in your line of work, Vincent. So many stories, so many secrets. I imagine it's easy to forget that every passenger is carrying a history of their own." Vincent's hands tightened on the steering wheel. He hadn't told the man his name. Not tonight, not ever. The app may be. But even then, most people didn't bother to use it. They just got in, gave a nod, and stared at their phones until the ride was over. This man was different. He was paying attention. "Yeah, I guess," Vincent said, trying to keep his tone light. "You get all kinds. Some people want to talk your ear off, others just want to get where they're going. And which do you prefer?" the man asked, his eyes meeting Vincent's in the mirror. "The talkers or the silent types?" Vincent hesitated. "I don't mind either way. It's just a job, you know?" The man nodded, as if he'd expected that answer. "Of course, just a job. But sometimes a job is more than it seems. Sometimes it's a test, a way of seeing what a person is really made of." Vincent felt his pulse quicken. He tried to laugh it off. "You sound like you've done this before." The man's smile widened, but there was no warmth in it. "In a manner of speaking, I've spent a long time watching people, learning what makes them tick, what makes them break." The words hung in the air, heavy and unspoken. Vincent tried to focus on the road, but his mind kept circling back to the man's face, the way his eyes seemed to see straight through him. He thought about the stories he'd heard from other drivers, stories about passengers who never made it to their destination, about rides that ended in places no one wanted to talk about. He'd always dismissed them as urban legends, the kind of tales people told to make the night seem less empty. But now, with this man in his back seat, Vincent wasn't so sure. The miles slipped by in silence, the tension in the car growing thicker with each passing minute. Vincent found himself replaying every decision that had led him to this moment, the missed opportunities, the bad choices, the secrets he tried so hard to bury. He wondered if the man in the back seat knew about those two dots. They passed the exit for Lakeland. The man leaned forward slightly, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "Tell me, Vincent, do you ever think about the past? About the things you've done, the people you've left behind?" Vincent's mouth went dry. He forced a laugh, but it sounded hollow. "Doesn't everyone?" The man's eyes never left his. "Not everyone. Some people spend their whole lives running from the past. Others embrace it. The difference is what happens when the past finally catches up." Vincent swallowed hard, his mind racing. He wanted to ask the man what he meant, wanted to demand answers, but something held him back. Maybe it was fear. Maybe it was the sense that, for the first time in a long time, he was sitting across from someone who already knew the answers. The car sped on through the darkness. The world outside reduced to shadows and fleeting glimpses of light. Vincent felt the weight of the man's gaze, the sense that he was being watched, measured, judged. He wondered how much the man knew, how much he could possibly know. And he wondered, for the first time, if this ride would end the way he expected. The silence returned, deeper and more oppressive than before. Vincent tried to focus on the road, on the familiar rituals of driving, the turn of the wheel, the pressure of the gas pedal, the steady rhythm of the tires on asphalt. But the man's presence was impossible to ignore. He was like a shadow that had slipped into the car, a ghost from a life Vincent had tried to forget. He thought about the money again, about the promise of a better tomorrow. But as the miles ticked by and the darkness deepened, Vincent began to realize that some debts can't be paid with cash. Some debts follow you, no matter how far you run. The man in the back seat said nothing more, but his silence was louder than any accusation. Vincent drove on, the highway stretching out before him like a question he didn't know how to answer. And somewhere, deep inside, he began to understand that this ride was different, that this night would not end the way he hoped. The city lights faded behind them, swallowed by the endless black of the Florida night. The only sound was the hum of the engine and the steady, unblinking gaze of the man who knew too much. Vincent kept his eyes on the road, but he could feel the past closing in, mile by mile, heartbeat by heartbeat. And in the darkness, he wondered if he was driving toward redemption or something far, far worse. The Past Resurfaces highway unspooled before them, a ribbon of black cutting through the heart of Florida. The world outside the car was a blur of darkness and the occasional flash of headlights from distant trucks. But inside, the air was thick with unspoken questions. Vincent tried to focus on the road, on the familiar comfort of the steering wheel beneath his hands, but his mind kept drifting back to the man in the back seat. There was something about him, something that made the hairs on the back of Vincent's neck stand up, as if he were being watched by something more than human. For a while, the silence held. The only sounds were the low hum of the engine and the faint, rhythmic thump of the tires over the seams in the asphalt. Vincent's thoughts wandered, circling the same old worries, the rent, the bills, the endless grind of survival. But beneath those everyday anxieties, something older and darker was stirring. Memories he'd spent years trying to forget, secrets he'd buried so deep he sometimes wondered if they were even real. He glanced at the rearview mirror, catching a glimpse of the man's face in the shifting light. The passenger's eyes were fixed on the road ahead, but there was a sharpness to his gaze, a sense of calculation that made Vincent uneasy. It was as if the man were waiting for something, waiting for the right moment to strike. They passed the exit for Lakeland, the last outpost of civilization before the long, empty stretch toward the Gulf. Vincent felt a strange sense of relief, as if leaving the city behind might somehow protect him from whatever was coming. But the feeling didn't last. "Tell me, Vincent," the man said suddenly, his voice cutting through the silence like a knife. "Do you ever think about your time in Miami?" The question landed with the force of a physical blow. Vincent's foot eased off the accelerator before he even realized what he was doing. Miami. He hadn't heard that name spoken aloud in years, not in connection with him, not in the way the man said it now. He tried to play it cool, forcing a laugh that sounded hollow even to his own ears. "I've been through there a few times," he said, keeping his eyes on the road. "Why do you ask?" The man's smile was thin, almost pitying. "Oh, I think you know the Miami I'm referring to. The Miami of 15 years ago, when you were considerably more entrepreneurial in your business ventures." Vincent's hands tightened on the steering wheel, his knuckles turning white. The darkness outside the car seemed to press in closer, the highway narrowing until it felt like a tunnel. He swallowed hard, trying to keep his voice steady. "I think you've got me confused with someone else," he said, but the words sounded weak, even to him. The man didn't miss a beat. "Francisco Miguel Carrera. Born in Tampa, 1978. Mother was Maria Santos. Worked as a nurse at Tampa General until her death in 2004. Father unknown, though I suspect you have your suspicions. You attended community college for 2 semesters before discovering that traditional education wasn't suited to your particular talents." Each word fell like a stone into still water, sending ripples of recognition through Vincent's carefully constructed present. He hadn't used his middle name in over a decade, and his mother's maiden name was buried so deep in his past that even he sometimes forgot it existed. The man's knowledge was surgical, precise, and utterly terrifying. Vincent's mind raced. Who was this man? A cop? A private investigator? Someone from the old days, come to settle a score? He tried to keep his breathing steady, but his heart was pounding in his chest. "You married Isabel Restrepo in 2009. The man continued, his tone conversational, almost friendly. "A lovely girl. She works at the dental office on West Shore Boulevard now, doesn't she? Dr. Patel's practice. She has no idea about your previous career, I imagine." Vincent's hands were shaking now, a fine tremor that he couldn't control. He wanted to pull over, to demand answers, but something told him that would be a mistake. He forced himself to keep driving, the highway stretching out before him like a lifeline. "Who the hell are you?" he asked, his voice barely more than a whisper. The man's eyes met his in the mirror, cold and unblinking. "Someone with a long memory and longer patience," he said. "Someone who believes that certain debts should be paid in full, regardless of how much time has passed." They were approaching the exit for Highway 60, the turnoff that would take them west toward the Gulf Coast and the final stretch to Naples. Vincent's mind raced through possibilities. He could take the exit, find a police station, claim his passenger was threatening him. But what would he tell them? That a well-dressed man had stated publicly available facts about his life. That he felt threatened by polite conversation. And besides, there were things about his past that wouldn't bear close examination even now. "You're thinking about your options," the man observed, his voice calm. "That's good. It shows you understand the gravity of the situation. But I should tell you that turning back now would be inadvisable. You see, I'm not the only one interested in renewing our acquaintance." Vincent's voice cracked. "Our acquaintance? I've never seen you before in my life. But you have, Vincent. You've simply forgotten. Memory is a curious thing. We remember what serves us and forget what doesn't. But I've found that the right stimulus can restore." even the most carefully buried recollections. The man reached into his coat pocket and withdrew something, a photograph, old and slightly faded. He held it up to catch the light from the dashboard, even upside down in the rearview mirror. Vincent could make out the image, a younger version of himself standing next to a white panel van, his arm around the shoulders of a thin, dark-haired girl who couldn't have been more than 17. Her name was Carmen, the man said quietly. Carmen Vega. Do you remember her now? The photograph might as well have been a physical blow. Vincent felt the air rush out of his lungs as 15 years elapsed into a single moment of perfect, terrible clarity. Carmen Vega, sweet Carmen with her shy smile and her dreams of becoming a teacher. Carmen, who trusted him when he'd offered her a job. Trusted him when he told her it was just a simple medical procedure. Trusted him right up until the moment she'd seen the surgical instruments and tried to run. I see you do remember, the man continued, his voice soft but relentless. Carmen was my niece, my sister's only child. She was going to start college that fall, full scholarship to Florida State. She was going to study elementary education. Vincent's vision blurred around the edges. The highway ahead seemed to stretch infinitely, a tunnel of light leading nowhere. He tried to speak, but the words caught in his throat. That was a long time ago, he managed. I'm not that person anymore, aren't you? The man asked, his tone almost gentle. You still drive at night, still prey on the vulnerable, still take advantage of people who trust you with their safety. The only difference is the scale of your predation. Vincent shook his head, desperate to deny it. I drive for a rideshare company. I help people get where they need to go. Yes, I know. Uber, specifically. Driver rating of 4.8 stars. Very impressive. Though I wonder what your passengers would think if they knew about your previous career. The organ harvesting operation you ran out of that warehouse in Little Havana. The 23 people who went in and never came out. 23. Vincent had tried so hard to forget the exact number, but it burned in his memory like a brand. 23 people who'd answered ads for easy money, who'd been told they could make $5,000 for a simple procedure. 23 people who discovered too late that the procedure was permanent. The police shut us down, Vincent said, though even as he spoke the words, he knew how inadequate they sounded. Everyone involved went to prison. Not everyone, the man corrected. You disappeared 3 days before the raid. Very convenient timing. I've often wondered how you knew to run. Vincent said nothing. He couldn't explain about Detective Morrison, about the envelope of cash that had bought him a 12-hour head start. Morrison was dead now anyway, heart attack 5 years ago, taking that particular secret to his grave. The warehouse is still there, you know, the man continued. Abandoned, condemned, but still standing. The city keeps talking about tearing it down, but somehow the funding never materializes. I like to think of it as a monument to your work. They were passing through Arcadia now, deep in the agricultural heart of Florida. The landscape had flattened into endless pastures and orange groves, broken only by the occasional farmhouse or barn. Vincent had driven this route dozens of times over the years, but tonight it felt like a journey through an alien landscape. Where exactly are we going? Vincent asked, his voice barely steady. I thought that would be obvious by now. We're going home, Vincent. Back to where it all began. The warehouse was torn down years ago. I checked, did you? When was the last time you actually drove past it? When was the last time you set foot in Miami at all? Vincent couldn't answer because he already knew the truth. He'd avoided Miami like a plague city for 15 years, rooting around it even when it meant adding hours to a trip. He'd told himself it was just practical caution, but the reality was simpler and more shameful. He was afraid of what he might find. They're afraid of the ghosts that might be waiting for him in the shadows of his former life. Your passenger rating is very good, the man said, changing the subject with the casual precision of a surgeon making an incision. I read through your reviews before booking this trip. So many satisfied customers. Professional and courteous, clean car, and safe driving. Made me feel secure during a late-night trip. That last one was from a young woman named Jessica. She was traveling alone from the airport to her hotel. 22 years old, about the same age Carmen would be now if she'd lived. Stop, Vincent whispered, but the man continued, relentless. She trusted you with her safety, just like they all do. Just like Carmen did. The app makes it so easy, doesn't it? All that personal information, all that trust placed in the hands of strangers. Name, pickup location, destination, even a photo. A predator's paradise, really. I've never hurt anyone. Not since Miami, haven't you? What about all the rides you've canceled when the passenger was too drunk to notice? All the detours you've taken through empty neighborhoods? All the young women you've offered to help with their luggage getting just a little too close? Letting your hands linger just a moment too long? Each accusation hit like a physical blow because each one carried just enough truth to sting. Vincent had never acted on his impulses, had never crossed the line from thought to action. But the impulses themselves were still there, coiled in the dark corners of his mind like sleeping serpents. You know what I find most interesting about your reviews? The man continued. The patterns. Young women consistently rate you lower than other demographics. Not dramatically, just a few tenths of a point on average. But it's there if you know how to look for it. They sense something, don't they? Some primitive warning system that tells them you're not quite what you pretend to be. They were approaching the outskirts of Fort Myers now. The urban sprawl beginning to reassert itself after miles of rural darkness. Vincent could see the glow of the city reflected in the low-hanging clouds, a dome of artificial light that seemed almost welcoming after the oppressive darkness of the countryside. I want you to pull over, Vincent said suddenly, his voice shaking. This ride is over. I'm afraid that's not possible. You see, we have a contract. You accepted the ride, and I've paid for your services. It would be unprofessional of you to leave me stranded. I don't care about the money, but I do, Vincent. I care very much about getting my money's worth, and I haven't, not yet. The man leaned forward, close enough that Vincent could smell his cologne, something expensive and faintly medicinal. The air in the car felt heavy, charged with the weight of everything unspoken. Tell me about the disposal site, the man said, his voice barely above a whisper. What? The place where you got rid of the bodies. I know you didn't keep them at the warehouse. Too risky. Too much traffic. You had somewhere else. Somewhere remote. Somewhere you could work in peace. Vincent's hands were shaking now, a fine tremor that seemed to emanate from somewhere deep in his chest. He tried to deny it, to claim ignorance, but the memories came flooding back, despite his desperate attempts to suppress them. The long drives through the Everglades, the weight of the plastic-wrapped bundles, the sound of the water closing over them with barely a splash. He'd chosen the location carefully, a remote oxbow lake, 20 miles from the nearest road, accessible only by an abandoned logging trail that hadn't seen traffic in decades. The Everglades, he said, the words torn from his throat like a confession. There's a lake off the old Tamiami Trail. I know, the man said softly. I've been there many times over the years. It's quite peaceful, actually. The kind of place where a person could think clearly about their choices. Vincent stared straight ahead, his mind reeling. The past had found him, patient and implacable as gravity, and it would not be denied. "Why are you doing this?" he asked, his voice barely audible. The man's answer was simple, but it carried the weight of a lifetime. "Because someone has to. Because justice delayed is not justice denied, merely justice refined. Because Carmen deserves better than to be forgotten, filed away in some bureaucrat's cold case folder." The car sped on through the night, the highway stretching out before them like a road to nowhere. Vincent drove in silence, the weight of his sins pressing down on him with every mile. He knew, with a certainty that was almost comforting, that there would be no escape. Not this time. The past had finally caught up with him, and there was nowhere left to run. The accusation, the city lights of Fort Myers faded behind them, swallowed by the darkness of the open highway. Vincent's hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly that his knuckles ached, but he barely noticed. Every muscle in his body was tense, every nerve on fire. The man in the back seat had become a presence as heavy as the night itself, an unblinking judge, a living memory of everything Vincent had tried to forget. For a few minutes, neither of them spoke. The silence was no longer empty. It was charged, electric, as if the car itself were holding its breath. Vincent's mind raced, searching for a way out, a loophole, a lie convincing enough to buy him time. But the man's knowledge was too precise, his patience too absolute. There was no room for denial, no space for escape. The man broke the silence first, his voice as calm and measured as ever. "You know, Vincent, I've spent years studying people like you. Men who think they can outrun the past, who believe that a new name, a new city, a new job can erase what's come before. But the truth is, the past is patient. It waits, it watches. And when the time is right, it returns demanding payment in full." Vincent swallowed hard, his throat dry. He wanted to protest, to insist that he was different, that he'd changed. But the words wouldn't come. Deep down, he knew they would be lies, and the man in the back seat would see through them in an instant. The man continued, his tone almost conversational. "You were clever, I'll give you that. The operation in Miami was well organized. The ads were convincing, easy money, no experience necessary, medical supervision provided. You even had a doctor on staff, didn't you? Or at least someone who claimed to be one." Vincent stared straight ahead, the road blurring before his eyes. He remembered the warehouse in Little Havana, the way the fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, the smell of antiseptic and fear. He remembered the faces, so many faces, each one hopeful, desperate, trusting. He remembered Carmen most of all. "You know what I find most interesting?" the man asked, leaning forward so that his face was illuminated by the dashboard's pale glow. "It's not the money you made or the lives you ruined. It's the way you justified it to yourself. You told yourself you were providing a service, that the people who came to you knew the risks. But you and I both know that's not true. They were vulnerable. They were desperate. And you preyed on them." Vincent's jaw clenched. He wanted to argue, to defend himself, but the words caught in his throat. He remembered the first time he'd watched someone sign the consent form, their hands shaking, their eyes wide with hope and fear. He remembered telling himself it was just business, that everyone had a choice. But the truth was uglier than that. The truth was that he'd chosen them, not the other way around. The man's voice grew softer, almost gentle. "Carmen was 17. She trusted you. She thought you were giving her a chance, a way out, a way up. She didn't know what you really wanted. She didn't know what you were capable of." Vincent's vision blurred. He remembered Carmen's smile, the way she'd laughed at his jokes, the way she'd looked at him with hope in her eyes. He remembered the moment she realized what was happening, the terror in her voice as she begged him to let her go. He remembered the sound of her sobs echoing off the concrete walls. The man's words were relentless. You told yourself it was just business, that you were helping people, but you weren't. You were taking from them, taking everything. Their trust, their hope, their lives. And when it was over, you walked away. You started over. You pretended it never happened. Vincent shook his head, tears stinging his eyes. I didn't have a choice, he whispered, the words sounding hollow even to him. I was in too deep. There was no way out. There's always a choice, the man replied, his tone hardening. You chose yourself. Every single time. And now it's time to pay the price. The car sped through the darkness, the world outside reduced to shadows and fleeting glimpses of light. Vincent felt as if he were trapped in a nightmare, unable to wake, unable to escape. The man's presence was suffocating, his words a noose tightening around Vincent's throat. You know what happened to the others? The man asked, his voice low. The ones who worked with you, the ones who didn't run. Vincent nodded, unable to speak. He remembered the news reports, the mugshots, the sentences handed down in courtrooms filled with reporters and grieving families. He remembered the relief he'd felt at having escaped, the guilt that had followed him ever since. They went to prison, the man said. Some of them died there. Others are still serving time. But you disappeared. You changed your name, moved to a new city, started a new life. You thought you were free. Vincent's hands trembled on the wheel. He wanted to scream, to beg for mercy, but he knew it would do no good. The man in the back seat was not interested in forgiveness. He was here for something else, something colder, more final. The man leaned back, his eyes never leaving Vincent's. You know, I used to believe in justice. I used to think the system worked, that the guilty would be punished and the innocent protected. But then I saw what happened to Carmen. I saw how easily you slipped through the cracks, how quickly you disappeared. And I realized that sometimes justice needs a helping hand. Vincent's heart pounded in his chest. He thought about Isabel, about the life he'd built, the fragile piece he'd managed to carve out of the wreckage of his past. He thought about the people he'd hurt, the lives he'd destroyed. He wondered if any of it could ever be forgiven. The man's voice was soft, almost a whisper. Do you remember the last thing Carmen said to you? Vincent closed his eyes, the memory rising unbidden. He remembered the fear in her voice, the way she'd pleaded with him, the way she'd called out for her mother. He remembered the sound of her sobs, the way her hands had trembled as she tried to push him away. She asked you why, the man said, his voice breaking. She asked you why you were doing this. And you couldn't answer her. You couldn't even look her in the eye. Vincent's breath came in ragged gasps. He remembered the look in Carmen's eyes, the betrayal, the terror, the heartbreak. He remembered turning away, unable to face what he'd done. The man's words were like knives, each one cutting deeper than the last. You left her there. You let her die, and then you walked away. You told yourself it was just business, that you had no choice. But you did. You always did. The car sped on, the darkness pressing in from all sides. Vincent felt as if he were drowning, the weight of his guilt dragging him under. He wanted to beg for forgiveness, to plead for mercy, but he knew it was too late. The past had caught up with him, and there was nowhere left to run. The man's voice was cold, implacable. You know what the worst part is? It's not the dying. Death comes to everyone eventually. It's the waste. 23 people who might have done something meaningful with their lives, who might have made the world a little better, a little brighter. All of that potential, all of those possibilities snuffed out for the sake of your profit margins. Vincent turned in his seat, desperate to see the man's face, to find some trace of mercy in his eyes. But the man's expression was unreadable, his gaze fixed on a point far beyond the confines of the car. Carmen wanted to be a teacher, the man said, his voice barely audible. She used to volunteer at the local elementary school, reading to the children. She had this way of making the stories come alive, of making the kids believe that anything was possible. She could have inspired thousands of children over the course of her career. Think about the ripple effects of that. The scientists and artists and teachers that those children might have become. All of that lost because you needed money for drugs and expensive clothes. Vincent's voice was a broken whisper. I was sick. I was addicted. I wasn't thinking clearly. The man's eyes flashed with anger. Were you thinking clearly when you took those photographs? When you kept souvenirs from your victim? That wasn't addiction, Vincent. That was pleasure. Vincent flinched as if struck. He remembered the Polaroid camera, the growing collection of images, the way he'd told himself it was just good business practice. But the truth was uglier than that. The truth was that he'd liked looking at the photographs later, liked remembering the moment when his subjects had realized what was happening to them. The man's voice was cold, clinical. You enjoyed it. You enjoyed the power, the control. You told yourself it was just business, but it was more than that. It was about proving to yourself that you could get away with it. That you were smarter, faster, better than everyone else. Vincent shook his head, tears streaming down his face. I'm sorry, he whispered. I'm so sorry. The man's expression softened, just for a moment. Sorry doesn't resurrect the dead. Sorry doesn't give Carmen back her chance to become a teacher. Sorry is just another word for regret. And regret is just the tax we pay for our choices. The car slowed as they approached a deserted industrial area on the outskirts of Naples. The streets were empty, the buildings dark and silent. Vincent pulled over next to a loading dock surrounded by rusted shipping containers, his hands shaking so badly he could barely turn off the engine. The man leaned forward, his face inches from Vincent's. This is where it ends, he said, his voice low and final. You've run long enough. You've hidden long enough. Tonight, you pay your debt. Vincent closed his eyes, the weight of his guilt pressing down on him like a physical force. He thought about Carmen, about the others, about the life he'd stolen and the lives he'd destroyed. He wondered if there was any forgiveness left in the world, any hope of redemption. But as the man opened the door and stepped out into the night, Vincent knew the answer. Some debts can never be repaid. Some sins can never be forgiven. And some stories can only end one way. The past had found him at last, and there was nowhere left to hide. The psychological game the car sat idling in the shadow of the loading dock. The engine's low rumble, the only sound in a world that seemed to have shrunk to the size of the front seat. Vincent's hands hovered over the keys, uncertain whether to turn the ignition off or keep the engine running, as if the simple act of movement might somehow break the spell that had settled over him. But the man in the back seat was in no hurry. He seemed to savor the silence, letting it stretch until it became unbearable. Vincent stared at his own reflection in the rearview mirror, searching for some sign of the man he used to be. But all he saw was a stranger, haunted, hollow-eyed and afraid. The man behind him was a study in composure, his posture relaxed, his gaze steady. He looked like someone who had all the time in the world, someone who had waited years for this moment and was determined to enjoy every second of it. Do you know what I find most fascinating about people like you, Vincent? The man asked, his voice soft and almost hypnotic. It's not the crimes themselves. It's the stories you tell yourselves afterward. The justifications, the rationalizations, the endless parade of excuses. You convince yourselves that you're different, that you're smarter, that you're not like the others. But in the end, you're all the same. You run, you hide, and you hope that the past will forget you. But it never does. Vincent tried to speak, but his mouth was dry, his tongue thick and uncooperative. He wanted to protest, to insist that he was different, that he'd changed. But the words wouldn't come. The man's gaze was too intense, too knowing. It was as if he could see straight through Vincent's skin, down to the secrets he'd buried so deep he'd almost convinced himself they weren't real. The man leaned forward, his face illuminated by the dashboard's pale glow. You know, I've spent a long time studying you, watching your patterns, your habits, your weaknesses. I know about the apartment you rent under a false name in Clearwater. I know about the storage unit where you keep your old surgical instruments. I know about the safety deposit box at the credit union where you've hidden the photographs. Vincent's heart pounded in his chest. He thought about the storage unit, the dusty boxes stacked in the corner, the Polaroids he told himself he destroyed years ago. He thought about the safety deposit box, the key hidden in the lining of his jacket, the photographs he'd kept just in case. He'd always told himself it was for protection, for leverage, for insurance against the day when the past came calling. But now, with the man's words echoing in his ears, he realized the truth. He'd kept them because he couldn't let go, because some part of him still needed to remember how. Vincent whispered, his voice barely audible. The man smiled, a slow, deliberate curve of his lips. 15 years and unlimited resources can uncover any secret. When you have enough money and enough patience, privacy becomes just another commodity to be purchased. Bank records, medical files, employment history, it's all available to those who know where to look and what to pay. Vincent shivered, the cold seeping into his bones. He thought about the years he'd spent looking over his shoulder, the endless parade of new cities, new jobs, new identities. He'd always believed he was one step ahead, always believed he could outrun the consequences of his actions. But now, with the man's words hanging in the air, he realized how naive he'd been. The past wasn't something you could escape. It was something you carried with you, like a shadow that grew longer with every lie you told. The man's voice was gentle, almost sympathetic. You must be tired, Vincent. Tired of running, tired of hiding, tired of pretending to be someone you're not. It's exhausting, isn't it? The constant vigilance, the endless fear that one day someone will recognize you. That one day the mask will slip and the world will see you for what you really are. Vincent's hands trembled on the steering wheel. He thought about Isabel, about the life he'd built, the fragile piece he'd managed to carve out of the wreckage of his past. He thought about the nights he'd lain awake, staring at the ceiling, waiting for the knock on the door that never came. He thought about the dreams, the nightmares of Carmen's face, her eyes wide with terror, her voice pleading for mercy. The man's gaze was unrelenting. You know, I've read your reviews. All those satisfied customers, all those glowing testimonials. Professional and courteous, clean car, safe driving. Made me feel secure during a late night trip. But there's a pattern, Vincent. Young women consistently rate you lower than other demographics. Not dramatically, just a few tenths of a point on average. But it's there if you know how to look for it. They sense something, don't they? Some primitive warning system that tells them you're not quite what you pretend to be. Vincent flinched, the words hitting him like a slap. He remembered the rides he'd canceled at the last minute, the detours he'd taken through empty neighborhoods, the way he'd lingered just a little too long when helping a passenger with her luggage. He'd always told himself it was nothing, just a quirk, just a habit. But now, with the man's words echoing in his ears, he saw it for what it was, a pattern, a warning, a sign that the darkness inside him had never really gone away. The man's voice was soft, almost hypnotic. You tell yourself you've changed, that you're not the same person you were in Miami. But the truth is, the past is never really past. It's always there, waiting, watching, biding its time. And when the moment comes, it returns with a vengeance. Vincent's breath came in short, ragged gasps. He wanted to run, to hide, to disappear into the night. But there was nowhere left to go. The man in the back seat had closed every door, sealed every exit. All that was left was the truth, raw and unvarnished, staring him in the face. The man leaned back, his eyes never leaving Vincent's. You know what I find most interesting about your story? It's not the crimes themselves. It's the way you've managed to convince yourself that you're the victim, that you were forced into it, that you had no choice. But you did, Vincent. You always did. And every time, you chose yourself. Vincent shook his head, tears streaming down his face. I'm sorry, he whispered. I'm so sorry. The man's expression softened, just for a moment. Sorry doesn't change anything. Sorry doesn't bring Carmen back. Sorry is just another word for regret. And regret is just a tax we pay for our choices. The silence stretched between them, heavy and unyielding. Vincent felt as if he were drowning, the weight of his guilt dragging him under. He thought about the people he'd hurt, the lives he'd destroyed, the future he'd stolen from Carmen and the others. He wondered if there was any forgiveness left in the world, any hope of redemption. The man's voice was cold, implacable. You know what the worst part is? It's not the dying. Death comes to everyone eventually. It's the waste of 23 people who might have done something meaningful with their lives, who might have made the world a little better, a little brighter. All of that potential, all of those possibilities nuffed out for the sake of your profit margins. Vincent turned in his seat, desperate to see the man's face, to find some trace of mercy in his eyes. But the man's expression was unreadable, his gaze fixed on a point far beyond the confines of the car. Carmen wanted to be a teacher, the man said, his voice barely audible. She used to volunteer at the local elementary school, reading to the children. She had this way of making the stories come alive, of making the kids believe that anything was possible. She could have inspired thousands of children over the course of her career. Think about the ripple effects of that. The scientists and artists and teachers that those children might have become. All of that lost because you needed money for drugs and expensive clothes. Vincent's voice was a broken whisper. I was sick. I was addicted. I wasn't thinking clearly. The man's eyes flashed with anger. Were you thinking clearly when you took those photographs? When you kept souvenirs from your victims? That wasn't addiction, Vincent. That was pleasure. Vincent flinched as if struck. He remembered the Polaroid camera, the growing collection of images, the way he told himself it was just good business practice. But the truth was uglier than that. The truth was that he'd liked looking at the photographs later, liked remembering the moment when his subjects had realized what was happening to them. The man's voice was cold, clinical. You enjoyed it. You enjoyed the power, the control. You told yourself it was just business, but it was more than that. It was about proving to yourself that you could get away with it, that you were smarter, faster, better than everyone else. Vincent shook his head, tears streaming down his face. I'm sorry, he whispered. I'm so sorry. The man's expression softened, just for a moment. Sorry doesn't resurrect the dead. Sorry doesn't give Carmen back her chance to become a teacher. Sorry is just another word for regret. And regret is just the tax we pay for our choices. The car slowed as they approached a deserted industrial area on the outskirts of Naples. The streets were empty, the buildings dark and silent. Vincent pulled over next to a loading dock surrounded by rusted shipping containers. His hands shaking so badly he could barely turn off the engine. The man leaned forward, his face inches from Vincent's. "This is where it ends," he said, his voice low and final. "You've run long enough. You've hidden long enough. Tonight, you pay your debt." Vincent closed his eyes, the weight of his guilt pressing down on him like a physical force. He thought about Carmen, about the others, about the life he'd stolen and the lives he'd destroyed. He wondered if there was any forgiveness left in the world, any hope of redemption. But as the man opened the door and stepped out into the night, Vincent knew the answer. Some debts can never be repaid. Some sins can never be forgiven. And some stories can only end one way. The past had found him at last, and there was nowhere left to hide. The confession, the night air pressed in through the cracked window, thick with the scent of rain-soaked asphalt and distant orange groves. Vincent sat frozen behind the wheel, his mind a storm of panic and regret. The man in the back seat had not moved, but his presence filled the car like a shadow that could not be banished. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The only sound was Vincent's ragged breathing and the faint ticking of the cooling engine. Vincent's thoughts spun in frantic circles. He replayed every word the man had spoken, every accusation, every memory dragged from the depths of his past. He tried to tell himself it was a nightmare, that he would wake up in his own bed, safe and anonymous. But the pain in his chest, the sweat on his brow, the cold certainty in the man's eyes, these were all too real. The man broke the silence, his voice as calm as ever. "You know what I want, Vincent? I want the truth. Not the story you tell yourself, not the lies you've rehearsed for years. I want the truth about what happened in Miami, about what you did, about what you did with the bodies." Vincent's hands trembled on the steering wheel. He stared straight ahead, unable to meet the man's gaze in the mirror. He tried to summon the old defenses, the practiced denials, but they crumbled under the weight of the man's relentless certainty. "I don't know what you're talking about," Vincent whispered, but the words sounded weak, even to his own ears. The man's lips curled into a thin smile. "Of course you do. 23 people don't just disappear without a trace. The police found evidence of the organ harvesting, but they never found the bodies. You were very careful about that, weren't you? Very thorough." Vincent's mind flashed back to the warehouse, the cold fluorescent lights, the echo of footsteps on concrete. He remembered the faces, so many faces, each one trusting, each one desperate. He remembered the promises he'd made, the lies he'd told, the fear in their eyes when they realized what was really happening. He remembered the drives out into the Everglades, the long, lonely roads, the weight of the plastic-wrapped bundles in the trunk. He remembered the sound of the water closing over them, the way the darkness swallowed everything, leaving no trace. The man's voice was soft, almost gentle. "You chose the location carefully. A remote oxbow lake 20 miles from the nearest road, accessible only by an abandoned logging trail. You thought no one would ever find it. You thought you could bury the past and start over." Vincent's breath came in short, shallow gasps. He felt as if he were suffocating, the air in the car growing thinner with every passing second. He wanted to run, to hide, to disappear. But there was nowhere left to go. "The Everglades," he said at last, the words torn from his throat like a confession. "There's a lake off the old Tamiami Trail. I used to drive out there at night. I thought no one would ever find them. The man nodded as if he'd expected this answer. I know, I've been there many times over the years. It's quite peaceful, actually. The kind of place where a person can think clearly about their choices. Vincent closed his eyes, the memories flooding back in a torrent. He remembered the first time he'd driven out to the lake, the fear and adrenaline coursing through his veins. He remembered the way the moonlight glinted off the water, the silence broken only by the distant call of a night bird. He remembered the weight of the bodies, the way his hands shook as he pushed them into the water, the way he told himself it was just business, just survival, but the truth was uglier than that. The truth was that he'd chosen the lake because it was beautiful, because it was quiet, because it felt like a place where the world might forgive him. But the world never forgave. It only waited. The man's voice was relentless. Why did you do it, Vincent? Why did you keep going, even after you knew what it would cost? Vincent shook his head, tears streaming down his face. I was desperate. I needed the money. I thought I could control it. I thought I could stop whenever I wanted. But it got out of hand. It always gets out of hand. The man's eyes were cold, unblinking. You could have stopped. You could have walked away. But you didn't. You kept going, even when you knew it was wrong. Even when you knew people were dying. Vincent's voice was a broken whisper. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. The man's expression softened just for a moment. Sorry doesn't bring them back. Sorry doesn't erase what you did, but it's a start. The first step is admitting the truth. The second is facing the consequences. Vincent nodded, his shoulders shaking with silent sobs. He felt as if a great weight had been lifted from his chest, but the relief was fleeting. In its place was a cold, hollow ache, a sense of loss, so profound it threatened to swallow him whole. The man leaned forward, his face inches from Vincent's. You know what comes next, don't you? Vincent nodded again, unable to speak. The man's voice was low, almost a whisper. You're going to show me. You're going to take me to the lake. You're going to show me where you buried the past. Vincent's hands moved automatically, starting the engine, shifting the car into gear. He felt as if he were moving through a dream, his actions guided by a force outside himself. The road ahead was dark, the headlights cutting a narrow path through the night. The city fell away behind them, replaced by the endless, empty stretches of the Everglades. As they drove, the man spoke in a low, steady voice, guiding Vincent through the memories he tried so hard to forget. He asked about the warehouse, about the ads, about the people who had come to him for help and found only betrayal. He asked about Carmen, about the last time Vincent had seen her, about the promises he'd made and broken. Vincent answered every question, his voice growing steadier with each confession. He spoke of the fear, the guilt, the shame that had haunted him for years. He spoke of the dreams, the nightmares, the faces that visited him in the dark. He spoke of the hope he'd once had, the belief that he could start over, that he could be someone else. But with every mile, with every word, that hope faded. The truth was a weight he could no longer carry, a burden that had finally become too heavy to bear. The road narrowed, the trees closing in on either side. The headlights illuminated the old logging trail, the ruts and potholes familiar even after all these years. Vincent slowed the car, his hands steady on the wheel, his mind strangely calm. They reached the lake just as the first light of dawn began to creep over the horizon. The water was still, the surface unbroken, the world silent except for the distant call of a bird. Vincent parked the car, his hands trembling as he turned off the engine. The man stepped out first, his movements precise and deliberate. He walked to the edge of the water, staring out at the lake as if searching for something only he could see. Vincent followed, his footsteps heavy, his heart pounding in his chest. This is where it happened, Vincent said, his voice barely more than a whisper. This is where I brought them. This is where I tried to bury the past. The man nodded, his eyes never leaving the water. Thank you, Vincent. That's all I needed to know. Vincent stood beside him, the weight of his confession settling over him like a shroud. He felt empty, hollowed out, as if the act of telling the truth had stripped him of everything that had once made him human. The man turned to face him, his expression unreadable. You've done the right thing, Vincent. It doesn't erase what you did, but it's a start. The past can't be changed, but the future is still unwritten. Vincent nodded, tears streaming down his face. He felt a strange sense of peace, a sense that, for the first time in years, he could breathe. But as the sun rose over the lake, casting long shadows across the water, Vincent knew that peace would be short. The past had found him, and there was no escaping the consequences. The man placed a hand on Vincent's shoulder, his grip firm and unyielding. It's time, Vincent. Time to pay your debt. Vincent closed his eyes, the weight of his confession pressing down on him like a physical force. He thought of Carmen, of the others, of the lives he'd stolen and the futures he'd destroyed. He wondered if there was any forgiveness left in the world, any hope of redemption. But as the man led him back to the car, Vincent knew the answer. Some debts can never be repaid. Some sins can never be forgiven. And some stories can only end one way. The past had found him at last. And there was nowhere left to hide. The final choice, the sun was just beginning to rise, painting the sky in bruised shades of purple and gold. When Vincent and the man returned to the car, the world felt suspended between night and day, between the past and whatever future might still be possible. The lake behind them was a perfect mirror, its surface undisturbed, as if it had never been the silent witness to so many secrets. But Vincent knew better. He could feel the weight of those secrets pressing down on him. As real and heavy as the man's hand on his shoulder, they drove in silence, the car rolling slowly back down the rutted logging trail, the tires crunching over gravel and broken branches. Vincent's mind was a blank slate, wiped clean by exhaustion and the catharsis of confession. He had told the truth. He had finally spoken the words he'd kept locked away for so long. But the relief he'd hoped for was nowhere to be found. In its place was a cold, hollow ache, a sense that something irreversible had been set in motion. The man sat in the back seat, his posture as composed as ever, his eyes fixed on the horizon. He seemed almost serene, as if the events of the night had brought him a measure of peace. But Vincent knew better. He could feel the tension in the air, the sense that the real reckoning was still to come. As they reached the main road, the man spoke, his voice low and measured. You know, Vincent, there's a certain symmetry to all of this. You spent years running from your past, convincing yourself that you could start over, that you could become someone new. But the past is patient. It waits, it watches. And when the time is right, it demands payment in full. Vincent gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles white. He wanted to protest, to insist that he'd changed, that he'd tried to make amends. But the words died in his throat. He knew they would sound hollow, even to himself. The man continued, his tone almost gentle. I told you at the beginning of this ride that I was giving you a choice. The same choice you gave your victims. You can cooperate, and your end will be quick and professional. Or you can resist, and it will be educational. Vincent's heart pounded in his chest. He thought about the people he'd hurt, the lives he'd destroyed, the futures he'd stolen. He thought about Carmen, about the hope in her eyes, about the terror in her final moments. He wondered if there was any forgiveness left in the world, any hope of redemption. He looked at the man in the rearview mirror. searching for some trace of mercy, some sign that this was all a test, that he might still be allowed to walk away. But the man's expression was unreadable, his eyes cold and implacable. "Why the Rideshare?" Vincent asked, his voice barely more than a whisper. "You could have just grabbed me off the street. Why go through all of this?" The man's lips curled into a faint smile. "Where would be the poetry in that? This way, you're complicit in your own destruction. You chose to accept the ride. You chose to drive to your own execution. There's a certain elegant justice in that, don't you think?" Vincent felt a wave of nausea wash over him. He realized, with a kind of grim clarity, that the man was right. He had chosen this. Every step, every decision, every lie, and every evasion had led him to this moment. He had built his own prison, brick by brick, and now there was no way out. They entered Naples as the city was waking up, the streets slowly filling with the first commuters, the early morning joggers, the delivery trucks making their rounds. The world looked ordinary, almost peaceful, but Vincent felt as if he were moving through a dream. The car was a coffin, the road a funeral procession. The man gave directions in a calm, unhurried voice, guiding Vincent through a maze of industrial streets, past warehouses and shipping yards, to a deserted lot on the edge of the city. The place was perfect, isolated, forgotten. A place where no one would hear a scream or notice a body. "Stop here," the man said. His tone final. Vincent pulled over, his hands shaking so badly he could barely put the car in park. He stared at the dashboard, at the glowing numbers of the clock, at the empty passenger seat beside him. He thought about Isabel, about the life he'd built, about the fragile piece he'd managed to carve out of the wreckage of his past. He wondered if she would ever know what had happened to him, if she would ever understand why he had disappeared. The man leaned forward, his face inches from Vincent's. "This is your last chance, Vincent. You can make this easy, or you can make it hard. But either way, it ends here." Vincent closed his eyes, the weight of his choices pressing down on him like a physical force. He thought about Carmen, about the others, about the lives he'd stolen, and the futures he'd destroyed. He wondered if there was any forgiveness left in the world, any hope of redemption. He opened his eyes and looked at the man, his voice steady for the first time all night. "Do what you have to do." The man nodded, a look of respect flickering across his face. "You're braver than I expected." He reached into his coat and pulled out a small, gleaming object, a surgical knife, the kind Vincent had once used in another life. The blade caught the morning light, flashing silver and cold. Vincent felt a strange sense of calm settle over him. He realized, with a kind of detached clarity, that he was ready. He was tired of running, tired of hiding, tired of pretending to be someone he wasn't. He was ready to pay his debt. The man's voice was soft, almost kind. "Tell me, Vincent, do you have any last words?" Vincent thought for a moment, searching for something meaningful to say. He thought about apologizing, about begging for forgiveness, but the words felt empty. In the end, he simply shook his head. The man nodded, his expression unreadable. "Very well." He moved with the precision of a surgeon, his hand steady and sure. Vincent felt a sharp burning pain, followed by a strange sense of floating, as if he were rising above his own body, watching the scene from a great distance. He saw the man's face, calm and composed, saw the blood spreading across his shirt, saw the world fading to black. His last coherent thought was that the man was right. There was a certain elegant justice in the way it ended. He had spent his life taking from others, stealing their futures to fund his present. Now someone had come to collect the debt, with interest compounded over 15 years of patient waiting. As the darkness closed in, Vincent felt a strange sense of peace. The past had finally caught up with him, and for the first time in years, he was free.